Have you ever felt like your life was perfectly mapped out, just waiting for you to start living your dream? That's exactly how I felt. My wedding dress carefully chosen, the rings gleaming inside their velvet box, the guest list finalized. Every detail of my wedding looked like it had been pulled straight from the script of one of those romantic movies we watch with a sigh. All that was missing was the big day itself. But life, that whimsical old lady, has a peculiar habit of testing us when we least expect it. What was supposed to be a simple family gathering turned into the beginning of my personal nightmare. In just a few days, I watched my world fall apart: the wedding cancelled, betrayal, manipulative in-laws, and a suspicious trip that changed everything. What seemed like the end of the line eventually turned out to be my liberation. Daniel, my fiancé, and I had been together for 6 years. Our relationship, full of differences, with him being practical and me a dreamer, seemed solid. Maybe that's why I never suspected that anything could go off track. Our plans were simple: an intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. Charleston, South Carolina, would be the backdrop for our vows, the white flowers, and the whispered promises. But while I was diving into all the details, someone else was quietly scripting a very different story. The first crack appeared with what seemed like an innocent suggestion: a trip. Helen and George, my future in-laws, proposed that Daniel take a quick bachelor getaway, one last trip before he committed forever. Just a harmless escape, they said, to clear his mind. Naively, I believed them. I trusted them because, up until then, I had never imagined that love and manipulation could walk hand in hand. But the truth is, Helen and George were never big fans of our relationship. They always smiled coldly at family gatherings, casting calculating glances. To them, I was never the right choice. Looking back now, it's easy to see that trip was carefully orchestrated. When I first heard about it, I felt a pit in my stomach, that unsettling feeling you can't quite explain. Even so, I ignored it. The dress was ready, the invitations were sent out. Refusing would have seemed like irrational distrust. At the time, I didn't know it yet, but that feeling was a warning. While Daniel packed his bags, Helen and George assured me everything would be quick, discreet, nothing over the top. Just a family trip, they said, practically in chorus. And so, with a quick kiss and a rushed smile, he left. I stayed behind. Anxious but confident. After all, who would imagine that trip was the first act of a carefully planned sabotage? The first few hours passed slowly. I tried distracting myself with last-minute preparations, checking the guest list, going over details with the decorator. But deep down, something kept gnawing at me, a growing uneasiness, like I was standing on the edge of a painful revelation. The wake-up call came from afar. A friend who lived in Miami casually messaged me, "I saw Daniel yesterday." He wasn't alone. 3 little dots that felt like lead sinking into my chest. At first, I denied it. Who doesn't want to shut their eyes to the thing they fear most? I tried to ignore it. But that tiny seed of doubt grew fast. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator. It was like stepping into one of those mystery movies, where each discovery is both a stab and a release. In just a few days, the investigator unearthed a truth I never would have found on my own. Daniel, on that very trip, was involved with another woman. The photographic evidence was undeniable. There he was, smiling openly, arms around someone I had never seen before. And in the background, like silent spectators, stood Helen and George. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a premeditated performance. Facing those images, there was no room for doubt. The trip, the insistence on relaxing, Helen's rehearsed smiles, it all made sense now. I was the target. My wedding was the obstacle. And they, shamelessly, had plotted my downfall. But what they didn't realize was that, even shattered, I would find a strength I never knew I had. And what came next, the confrontation, the public exposure, and my rebuilding, was only the beginning of the story. Charleston had always been a charming city, with its cobblestone streets, historic mansions, and that timeless air of romance. It was there that Daniel and I first met, young, unaware of the winding paths fate would later lead us down. I grew up in a modest family where hard work and honesty were worth more than any prestigious last name. My father, a hardworking man, always said that a person's dignity isn't measured by the size of their house, but by the respect they show others. Daniel, however, came from a different world, a world of traditions, inheritances, and appearances maintained at any cost. Helen and George embodied all of that old money, rigid etiquette, silent dinners in enormous halls where every word was measured and every smile rehearsed. For them, life was a mathematical equation where feelings carried little weight and connections were valued for the social advantages they could bring. It didn't take me long to realize that, beneath their polite charm, there was an invisible wall of resistance. Family dinners felt like cold, calculated interrogations disguised as polite conversation. Helen would study me the way someone inspects a dress off the rack at an exclusive boutique, while George limited himself to dry, almost indifferent remarks. Despite this, Daniel seemed genuinely different. He was light-hearted, spontaneous, a man who laughed easily and made me believe we could build something separate from that rigid world. He spoke of our future with a spark in his eyes: travels, children, a house full of life. Simple dreams, but they meant everything to me. But over time, small cracks began to show. Invitations declined, plans cancelled, subtle comments about improving our social circle. Helen, always smiling, would casually remind me of their family traditions, subtly questioning whether I was ready for the life they envisioned for Daniel. The class difference wasn't just a backdrop, it was the center of the conflict. While I worked hard to build my career, Helen organized charity galas attended by the local elite. George, meanwhile, was like a ghost, appearing only at events where his presence was required to maintain the family's image. The rest of his time was spent managing old estates and discreet investments. When they suggested the trip, it wasn't an innocent gift. It was a calculated move, hidden under a veneer of good intentions. They knew Daniel well, knew his weaknesses, and they knew exactly how to manipulate him. The trip was carefully designed to pull him back into the world he had been trying to leave for love. It was within this web of expectations and manipulation that Lillian appeared. The daughter of an influential family, a familiar face at the same social events Helen and George frequented, Lillian was the embodiment of everything they wanted for their son: refined, discreet, and, most importantly, belonging. The perfect choice to preserve the status quo. At first, I had no idea she existed. It was only later, piecing things together, that I realized she had been casually inserted into the trip, like she just happened to be there, but with the clear goal of taking the place Helen and George believed I should never have occupied. They were playing a chess game where I was nothing more than a disposable piece. It was within this atmosphere of hypocrisy and silent social aggression that I had to find the strength to fight, not for Daniel, but for myself. Every sideways glance, every backhanded compliment, became a lesson in what I didn't want for my life. Charleston, with all its splendor, became the stage for a silent war between genuine love and the relentless pursuit of social acceptance. And in the middle of this battle, I started to realize that maybe my greatest victory would be refusing the role they were trying to force on me. What began as a nervous feeling in the pit of my stomach soon turned into a full-blown storm. After my friend's message, doubt quickly morphed into certainty. The trip, which was supposed to be just a brief pause before the wedding, started to take on darker outlines. Every vague answer from Daniel, every missed call, every lack of news fed the growing sense that something was wrong. That's when I made my decision. I needed proof. Hiring a private investigator felt like something out of a movie, but given the circumstances, it was the only way. I needed the truth, raw and undeniable. And it came, faster and more brutally than I could have imagined. The photos left no room for doubt. Daniel, holding Lillian's hand, strolling through the sun-drenched streets of Miami, smiling like a man with no commitments, like someone not about to stand at the altar with me. And who was there, lingering in the background like shadows? Helen and George, the silent architects of the whole charade. The initial shock was paralyzing. But then came the anger, a cold, clear anger that pushed me away from the role of victim. If they had orchestrated everything, if Daniel had given in, I wasn't going to be a passive observer in my own life anymore. I planned my confrontation carefully. No shouting, no scenes. Just facts. I prepared every step like a chess match, waiting for the perfect moment to knock the pieces over. Daniel came home as if nothing had happened. He brought back meaningless souvenirs, wore a tired smile, and had rehearsed excuses ready for any questions. But I didn't ask. I simply waited. That night, I set the scene in the living room with just one centerpiece, the folder containing all the photographic evidence. When he walked in, he immediately sensed the tension. I sat calmly, waited for him to sit as well, and then slid the folder across the table toward him without saying a word. I let him look at every photo, let him recognize every face. The color drained from his face within seconds. His lips parted, fumbling for an explanation, but before he could utter a word, the door opened. Helen and George, punctual as always, appeared as if staging a triumphant entrance for a grim theater. They didn't flinch at the sight of the folder. They didn't even try to hide it. Helen, with her unshakable composure, merely adjusted her blouse collar and said, with the utmost calm, "We did what was best for everyone." Daniel didn't have the strength to defend me. He didn't even try. And there, between measured glances and calculated phrases, the true face of that family was revealed. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about concern. It was about control, status, maintaining the pure lineage, as they liked to boast at nauseating dinner parties. George added, in his cold voice, "Lillian is a more suitable match for the kind of life we expect for Daniel." They spoke about me as if I were a mistake to be corrected, a torn page to be replaced with something more acceptable. I listened in silence. Inside me, something shifted. A strange feeling of liberation. I didn't need to prove anything to them. I didn't need to fight for a place in a world where I was never truly welcomed. At that moment, I knew I didn't belong there. Daniel, hesitating, tried to mumble something about thinking things over, about reconsidering. But it all sounded hollow, worn-out words from someone who hadn't had the courage to defend me when I needed him most. I stood up, took back the folder, and with all the calm I could muster, I said simply, "I hope you'll all be very happy." And I left, leaving behind not just a cancelled wedding, but a lifetime of expectations that had never truly been mine. The blow that was supposed to destroy me had the opposite effect. It became the beginning of something greater. The first step in my rebuilding. But, like any good story of downfall and rebirth, there was still much more to come. And the next stage would play out on a much bigger stage than that cold living room. It would be public. The days that followed were a strange mix of emptiness and determination. I had broken off my engagement with Daniel, but that didn't mean the emotional impact was any less real. His absence was tangible, but even stronger was the overwhelming sense that I had freed myself from something toxic that had been quietly corroding my peace for far too long. While I was processing everything, another part of the story began to unfold, and this time, I didn't have to lift a finger. Lillian, perhaps emboldened by her victory, started posting photos. At first, they were discreet, a quiet dinner here, a glass of wine there. But soon, they became bolder, shared smiles, spontaneous trips, affectionate glances. What she didn't realize, though, was that in the age of social media, nothing stays private for long. It took just one picture of her and Daniel, clearly recent, to spark public curiosity. People started talking. And not just close friends, colleagues, acquaintances, even distant relatives. The dates didn't match. The suspicious trip now had a very public face. And that's when the side plot began to snowball. Someone to this day I don't know who leaked part of the photographic evidence I had gathered. Maybe it was a sympathetic friend, or maybe someone else who had grown tired of the endless social hypocrisy. The fact is, the images spread like wildfire. In an instant, Helen and George found themselves cast as the unwilling protagonists of a local scandal. The social media platforms they once used to craft an image of perfection were now the stage for their public undoing. Comments flooded in a mix of outrage, gossip, and vicious memes. The very social circles where Helen once reigned with silent authority began to whisper, and whispers, in that world, are the deadliest kind of punishment. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my life quietly. I reconnected with friendships that had been neglected because of the relationship. I reinvested in my self-dance classes, short trips, small personal projects that had been shelved. But most importantly, I rekindled my relationship with myself. The story, however, wouldn't stop unfolding. Some of Daniel's old acquaintances began reaching out discreet messages, some filled with genuine support, others just thinly veiled curiosity wanting to know what really happened. The truth was, without me having to say a word, the real story was spreading. And, ironically, the more they tried to control the narrative and restore their image, the deeper they sank. Helen tried to deny everything in small social circles, dismissing it all as a misunderstanding. George, true to form, kept silent. But nothing could erase the pictures, the gossip, the public perception. The public exposure became a burden even they masters of appearances could not bear. In the midst of all this chaos, Lillian, the linchpin of the entire scheme, began to crumble too. Snide comments flooded her social media, questioning her behavior and pointing fingers at what she represented: not a love story, but the final product of a calculated manipulation. The pressure mounted with each passing day. The story grew larger and larger. More people knew about it, more details surfaced. And I realized that the less I responded, the more my silence worked in my favor. I let time be my ally, while on their side, the tension only grew. The masks had fallen, and there was no putting the pieces back together. In the end, I understood it wasn't just my story being exposed. It was the entire system, the rotten structure of appearances, convenience, and manipulation. And the subplot, which had started as an attempt to destroy me, ended up being the total unraveling of a family that had built sandcastles on carefully rehearsed lies. And this was just the beginning. I thought the storm had already passed. The public exposure, the comments on social media, the withdrawal of old allies from Daniel's family, everything pointed to the worst being over. But life, as always, had one more surprise in store. The real turning point wasn't the scandal, it was what came after. One day, returning from a short trip I had taken to get away from all the chaos, I found something unexpected in my mailbox: a letter. Handwritten, on high-quality paper, with no return address on the envelope. Just a name at the bottom: Lillian. Curious and cautious, I sat on the porch and began to read. The content was unsettling. Lillian was apologizing, not the empty, polite kind of apology, but a confession that, at least on the surface, seemed sincere. She revealed details I hadn't known: how Helen had approached her weeks before the trip, how she was offered an invitation to casually meet Daniel, no pressure, no commitments, just an opportunity to get to know each other. She said she initially resisted. But, encouraged by her own parents, silent accomplices in that status-driven society, she eventually gave in. She explained how, during the trip, everything had seemed carefully choreographed: casual encounters, arranged dinners, moments of bonding that were anything but spontaneous. The most shocking part? Lillian claimed Helen and George had promised her family tangible benefits: business deals, influential contacts, silent guarantees of social advancement, all in exchange for helping to distance Daniel from me. It was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just about family preferences. It was a cold, orchestrated plot, crafted by people who treated life like a political chessboard. And more surprising still, Lillian claimed that Daniel never knew the full extent of the plan. According to her, he had been manipulated as much as I had. The trip, the encounters, the growing intimacy, it was all staged to make him believe he was making his own decisions when, in reality, they were molding his choices behind the scenes. I closed the letter slowly, feeling the weight of the revelation. It was a truth that was hard to swallow. Daniel wasn't innocent, he had still given in, but neither was he the absolute villain of the story. In the end, he was just another victim of Helen and George's silent manipulation. The letter ended with a request that I not escalate the scandal, that I allow the dust to settle, that I give everyone, including her, a chance to start over. In a way, her confession was liberating. Not because of the apology, nor the attempt at peacemaking, but because of the clarity it brought. I wasn't just fighting against a broken engagement. I was fighting against an entire system, a way of life based on appearances, hidden power, and manipulation disguised as good intentions. It was at that moment that I realized my story wasn't just mine. It was the story of countless others who, like me, had been pushed into molds that didn't fit, who had been sacrificed at the altar of traditions they never asked for. And it was there, on that porch bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, that I made the decision that would change everything. I would no longer fight. I wouldn't waste my energy trying to expose or attack anyone. I wasn't interested in winning a war of appearances. My true triumph would be building a life for myself far from the invisible chains that had almost trapped me. That was my turning point. I chose silence. Not the silence of resignation, but the calm silence of someone who knows that the best response is living well. I placed the letter back into its envelope and tucked it away, not to feed resentment, but as a reminder I survived. And not only did I survive, I was reborn. The chaos Helen and George tried to sow ironically led to my ultimate liberation. While they worried about salvaging their reputation at high society events, I was finally beginning to build something that was entirely mine. No masks, no silent pacts, no compromises. It was the beginning of a new story. And this time, the script would be written by me. The impact of that letter lingered with me for days. Although I had decided not to retaliate, the truth was that the consequences were already beyond my control. The public exposure that had begun on social media wouldn't be erased by a simple plea for silence. The comments kept circulating quietly but persistently. People whispered in cafes, exchanged glances at social events, and spread the story like smoke on a windy day. Helen and George, who had spent their lives carefully crafting an immaculate image, now faced a very different reality. They made subtle attempts to restore their reputation, small gestures here and there, donations to local causes, carefully staged appearances at charity events, but nothing could erase what had already been etched into the town's collective memory. And Daniel? He disappeared from the social scene for a while. I heard he canceled his commitments, avoided family events, and buried himself in work. Without the constant protection of his parents, he seemed to be finally confronting his own choices or his lack of them. Lillian, on the other hand, tried to maintain appearances. Carefully curated photos, optimistic captions, discreet gatherings with new social circles. But the truth is, once a stain is exposed, it never fully disappears. She, too, felt the weight of the decisions she had made under others' influence. Meanwhile, I focused on something more important: rebuilding myself. I threw myself back into work, investing time and energy into things that truly made me happy. I revived personal projects I had shelved during the engagement, like the small photography studio I had always dreamed of opening. I rediscovered old passions: dance, spontaneous trips, the simple pleasure of a lazy afternoon. The friendships that survived the storm blossomed like never before. They remained not out of convenience, but out of true loyalty. Friends who genuinely cheered for me, who celebrated my freedom as if it were their own. The most curious thing was how my reactions began to change. Where once I might have felt satisfaction watching Helen and George face social rejection, now I felt nothing but indifference. It wasn't a lack of justice, it was maturity. I understood now that revenge would have been a waste of the hard-won freedom I had finally achieved. And the world kept turning. New scandals emerged, fresh gossip replaced the old, and slowly, the dust settled. Charleston, with its slow and graceful rhythm, absorbed the scandal and moved on, as it always does. Only a few discreet scars remained for those who knew where to look. But in me, the change was deeper. I was no longer the betrayed and humiliated bride. I became someone who chose herself. Someone who realized that abrupt endings, though painful, are sometimes necessary to make way for genuine new beginnings. The letter from Lillian, tucked away in a drawer, served as a silent reminder of it all. A testament that no matter how cruel the world may seem, dignity is a choice no one can take from you. And when, months later, I ran into Helen at a public event, she cast me a brief, almost imperceptible glance, one that said she knew she had lost. I simply smiled. Not out of arrogance, but relief. Relief in knowing that this time, I was the one who had truly won. Not because I humiliated anyone, but because, in the end, I chose peace. Healing isn't a single event. It's a slow process, built on small victories day after day. Once the dust had settled and the gossip faded, the real work began, rebuilding my life not just externally, but internally as well. The cancelled wedding, the betrayal, the manipulation, all of it had left deep marks. But scars don't have to be open wounds forever. They can become firm, discreet, and, above all, powerful symbols of strength. The first step was learning to be with myself again. The house, which once felt empty without Daniel's presence, started to come back to life. I redecorated, painted the walls, bought furniture that reflected my tastes, not what matched his family's style. Every small change was a declaration of independence, piece by piece, room by room. I went back to studying, something I had put aside during the engagement. I enrolled in photography and design courses, fields I had always loved but were once dismissed as unimportant hobbies during my relationship. The studio I had dreamed of finally began to take shape. Small, yes, but mine. And perhaps the most important step, I started reevaluating the relationships I kept around me. Many acquaintances simply vanished when the scandal broke, and though painful at first, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I was left only with those who truly mattered, people who stayed not for status, not for appearances, not for convenience. The friendships that survived the storm became stronger, deeper, more genuine. Learning to trust myself again was the greatest challenge. For years, I had measured my worth through the eyes of others, always trying to please, to fit in, to squeeze into tight molds of expectation. My experience with Daniel and his family only exposed how toxic that mindset had been. The process was gradual. I declined invitations that didn't make sense to me. I said no when I needed to. I learned that self-love isn't selfish, it's the foundation on which every other relationship must be built. In time, I started traveling again. At first, short trips to nearby towns, no rigid itineraries, just the pleasure of exploring the new. Later, bigger journeys to places I had always dreamed of visiting. Paris, for instance, never felt more magical than the first time I wandered alone along the banks of the Seine, finally feeling like I was the true author of my own story. But don't think it was all easy. There were days when doubt crept back in, when sadness squeezed my chest, when memories floated back like unwelcome ghosts. There were nights when I questioned whether it would have been easier to forgive, to insist, to try one more time. But in those moments, I reminded myself sometimes, insisting is the longest path to unhappiness. Healing is understanding that not every battle needs to be fought, and that some of the greatest victories are silent, invisible, but life-changing. Somewhere in the middle of this journey, I reconnected with a version of myself that had been asleep for far too long. The girl who dreamed big, who believed in futures built on effort and joy, not on strategies and appearances. The woman who understood that dignity and freedom walk hand in hand. The person who knows that happiness should never come at the cost of one's own essence. And so, little by little, I grew. Not in the traditional sense. I didn't buy a bigger house, didn't upgrade my car, didn't flaunt achievements on social media to prove anything to anyone. I grew inwardly. In maturity, in serenity, in authenticity. And it was in that growth that I found what I had long been searching for in all the wrong places: peace. Time passed, but life has a curious way of confronting us with our past just when we think we've left it behind. It was at a charity event where that unexpected reunion happened, a discreet dinner hosted by a local organization raising funds for social projects. The kind of event that, years ago, I would have attended with Daniel and his family, wearing the perfect smile and squeezing into uncomfortable shoes for the sake of appearances. But this time, I was different. Not just in appearance, in essence. Hair down, a dress I had chosen myself, comfortable, elegant. I went because I wanted to, not because someone expected me to. And there, among familiar faces and polite conversations, fate decided to play its game of irony. Helen and George were there. She, still impeccable, flashing a perfectly calculated smile. He, with his cold expression and air of superiority, as if nothing had ever happened. And, surprisingly, Daniel too. It felt like a frozen flashback, but to my surprise, there was no pain, no anger. Only the serene realization that they were still the same and I was not. The tension lingered in the air. I saw Helen notice my presence. Her scrutinizing gaze lingered a second longer than social etiquette allows before she recomposed herself. George didn't even shift his focus from his circle of acquaintances. Daniel, however, hesitated. His eyes met mine, carrying a mix of surprise, awkwardness, and something harder to define, regret, maybe. I took a deep breath and held my posture. It was strange how this encounter, which might have shaken me months earlier, now felt like just a footnote in the story I was writing for myself every day with my new choices. Throughout the evening, we exchanged a few brief glances, but none of us approached. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been resolved in the silence that followed our breakup. As the event carried on, I noticed something that made me smile quietly. The conversations around them were polite, yes, but distant. The smiles directed at Helen and George seemed forced, the glances fleeting. The social glow they had clung to so desperately was dimming, not because of overt scandals, but because of the subtle but unmistakable shift in the way people now viewed them. The carefully constructed mask of social perfection was cracking, and no one was pretending not to see it anymore. It was a silent reminder that, no matter how much we try to hide the truth beneath layers of good manners and social conventions, it will always find a way to reveal itself. I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in a long time. The past was where it belonged, behind me. The climax of my journey wasn't a dramatic confrontation or an explosive reckoning. It was the calm realization that true victory is moving forward, carrying only what's truly worth keeping. And so, with the serenity of someone who has weathered their storms, I prepared for the closing chapter of my story, not with resentment, but with the maturity of someone who had finally learned to choose herself. The true climax of the story wasn't marked by shouting or tears. It happened, like so many of life's unexpected turns, quietly and without fanfare. A few weeks after that charity event, I received an invitation that seemed ordinary at first, a local photography exhibit featuring new artists. One of the organizers was an old photography professor of mine who, aware of my recent dedication, insisted that I submit some of my work. I hesitated. For a moment, the old fear of judgment tried to creep back in. But I took a deep breath and decided to say yes, not for external validation, but because, this time, I wanted to. And that was enough. I put together a small series of photos that captured moments of freedom: a solitary boat sailing at sunset, a child running across an open field, a woman standing with her back to the camera, facing the sea with her hair in the wind. Simple images, but heavy with the feeling I carried: the quiet rebirth after the storm. On the day of the exhibit, I stood among artists, critics, and curious visitors. The gallery's white walls displayed windows into different worlds, different souls. And among all those silent voices in the images, mine were there too. I was walking through the room when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Are these yours?" I turned slowly. It was Daniel. He wore a dark suit and looked thinner, older. In his eyes, a mix of pride and regret. I stayed silent for a few seconds, observing the man I once loved who now seemed so distant, like a character from an old chapter. "They are," I replied calmly. He smiled, a timid, sincere smile, so different from the arrogant shield he once wore. He looked at the photos, then at me, and said, "They feel free." I nodded. There was nothing else that needed to be said. But he went on. "You look different." "I am different," I answered without hesitation. He shoved his hands into his pockets, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around, perhaps searching for words, perhaps for courage. He started, then stopped. Took a deep breath and tried again. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." It wasn't the first time I had heard an apology. But this time, it felt real. It wasn't wrapped in excuses or attempts to justify the unjustifiable. It was simple. Raw. "I'm sorry too," I said, with a small smile. I was, but not with the pain or resentment of the past. It was the mature compassion of someone who understands that some people simply can't be what we wish they could be. Daniel lingered for a moment longer and then stepped back. "I hope you keep capturing beautiful things like this," he said before turning and walking toward the exit. I watched him leave a little more hunched over, a little more human. I stood there, feeling a strange sense of relief. The weight I had carried for so long finally dissolved. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to him. Not to Helen and George. Not to the world. That brief exchange was the real climax of my story, the moment I fully realized that freedom isn't the absence of pain, it's not being chained to it. I turned my gaze back to the photos on the wall. In them, I saw the woman I had become, free, whole, and the sole author of her destiny. As the night wore on and visitors continued to admire the exhibit, I realized this wasn't just a display of images. It was the exhibition of my soul, and for the first time in a long time, it was at peace. Life, with all its unpredictable twists, had taught me that not every happy ending follows the script we once dreamed of. The cancelled wedding, the betrayal, the manipulation, all of it, which initially felt like a tragedy, had turned out to be a disguised blessing. I didn't find happiness in exchanged vows or lavish parties, but in rediscovering myself. After the exhibit, I went home with a deep sense of fulfillment. Not because I had exposed anyone, not because I had won an invisible battle, but because I had finally closed a chapter. I shut the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, let my hair down, and without overthinking, sat on the living room floor with a glass of wine, silently celebrating the woman who had risen from the ashes. Charleston, with its old streets and history soaked into every corner, remained the same. But I didn't. I had learned that self-love is the firmest ground on which a future can be built. I had learned that freedom and peace are worth more than any promise of eternity. And, above all, I had learned that no one has the right to say where your story ends, only you do. The echoes of everything I had lived through still lingered in the distance, but they no longer had power over me. Helen and George went on with their lives in what remained of their social circle, increasingly isolated. Daniel, from what I heard, moved to another city, trying to start over far from the ghosts he had helped create. And me? I finally understood that abrupt endings, though painful, are what allow for new beginnings. That starting over is often the greatest act of resilience. That having the courage to leave behind what no longer serves you is a powerful form of love. The story I had once been so afraid to tell became the foundation of who I am today. And as I look toward the future, I know the best is still to come, because this time, I'm the one writing the script. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in my newly opened studio, watching the soft light pour through the wide windows. In the corner, a camera rested on the table, silent, but full of promises. I thought back on everything I had lived through, not with sadness, but with a serene gratitude. Every choice, every pain, every rebirth had brought me here. I smiled, adjusted the focus, and for the first time in a long time, took a picture just for me. No rush, no script, no fear. It was just the beginning. If this story touched you in any way, remember, starting over is not failure, it's courage. Life doesn't always follow the plan we imagine, but sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Share this story with someone who might need the strength to take the first step toward their own freedom. And if you want to hear more powerful and inspiring stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next story might be the turning point you or someone close to you have been waiting for.